J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs are both forecasting $3,000 an ounce gold and paltry returns for stocks. Call the proud Americans of the Patriot Gold Group today before it's too late. Call 888-753-1647 for a free investor guide today. Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer 7 years in a row. Call 888-753-1647. Good Saturday morning. I'm still reporting on the national debt again and again and again. So it's debt ceiling time in the crime-ridden city on the Potomac. On one side is Rand Paul, a brilliant eye doctor who is right on most issues. On the other side of this argument is the new Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. Here's a snippet from Dr. Paul.
This will be the first time the debt ceiling's ever been increased by all Republicans. It'll be the first time that conservatives lose their moral high ground by voting for a debt ceiling increase, and not a small debt ceiling increase. This will be historically the greatest increase in the debt ceiling ever in our history, at a time when we're having trouble selling the 10-year bond, we're having interest rates at 5%. We also are having the interest payment over $1 trillion. Imagine what happens if the interest payment doubled. We're paying on average about 3.5% now. We were paying 1.7% on the debt. What if it doubles again? I think it'll be unmanageable. It'll crowd out all other spending.
And here is Secretary Bessent.
Things. We want to cut and constrain spending, and we want to grow the economy. And what Senator Paul is asking for or advocating for, I think, could cause a sudden stop in the economy. So, I'm a deficit hawk, but I'm also a realist.
What do you believe that would do?
Well, look, what's important here is our debt to GDP. If we don't grow, then we won't grow the tax base, and we're not going to grow revenues. We're not going to grow the economy. We inherited a mess, and we have to constrain spending, cut spending, and then grow our way out of this.
Both are right, given the constraints of the only two monetary systems they were taught in economics school. But both build their systems on a false or at least an incomplete premise. Secretary Bessent advocates for what's known in macroeconomic theory as growth-driven economics, where if you pump enough money into your economy, then you will increase the total debt but reduce the debt to GDP ratio, and that's the solution. The problem is that the so-called growth is based on borrowed money, the factor that no one dares to mention. Rand Paul prefers the austerity approach, where if spending is sufficiently cut, you reduce the national debt. But that's not true. You are still borrowing money to balance the budget. You are just borrowing less than Secretary Bessent's system. Neither system makes any sense to me. Neither one of these systems actually reduces the debt because they never can reduce the debt. That's an absolute impossibility. At this point, the debt is by far the nation's largest budget item, over $1 trillion per year. That means that if you cut out the entire defense budget, that still would not be enough. That's what they don't tell you, because if they stay within their systems, you can never reduce the actual debt. Just jigger around this debt to GDP ratio. But the overall debt will continue to climb into oblivion, and oblivion looms in the very near future. However, there is another solution, an older solution, one proven to work every time it has been employed in the United States. It was this nation's first money system and was endorsed by such figures as Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln. Now, that's a pretty prestigious list of advocates, don't you think? I've advocated for this system for at least 20 years now, but no one in official Washington has ever given me a call. It's called monetary reform, and it employs the same system that won the American Revolution, allowed President Jackson to be the one and only president to completely pay off the U.S. national debt, and helped President Lincoln win the Civil War despite opposition from the big bankers of New York. In the current system, believe it or not, all American money is created as an interest-bearing debt, all of it. This scam became law when the Federal Reserve System first passed Congress in 1913. It was designed to operate alongside the income tax to ensure the payment of taxes. The truth is, we don't need either one. President Trump was well on his way to uncovering this truth about the debt money system and income taxes when he started delving into tariffs a few months ago. So both of these two economic philosophies, the growth-driven plan and the austerity approach, do nothing to reduce the national debt. They are just reducing the speed of its growth. So what can we do about this? It's nothing new. It's called monetary reform. Remember back to the very first days Trump started talking about tariffs? What did he say? He said that with proper tariffs in place, we wouldn't need the income tax. Well, that revelation has slowly and carefully been put back under the covers, and now Trump is back to talking about merely reducing income taxes again, like every federal politician since 1913. A perpetual increasing national debt is a feature of the Federal Reserve System, not a bug. The bankers specifically designed the system so that the federal government would borrow ever-increasing amounts from them at interest. And they got Congress to pass the federal income tax to guarantee they would always get paid. It's really a flawless system if you are one of the lucky few who have a legal license to create money from nothing. There can be no legitimate discussion about spending priorities until the government stops borrowing the money it is spending. There is no reason for a sovereign nation to borrow money for any reason. It should have been forbidden by the Constitution, but thanks to Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of Treasury, who was the architect of the creation of the First Bank of the United States, Congress is allowed to borrow money into existence in the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, known as the Borrowing Clause. Both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, as well as George Mason, fiercely opposed the creation of this first privately owned central bank. The U.S. government owned just 20% of the stock, while the remaining 80% was held by private investors. This was how the debt money system came into being in the U.S. Throughout our history, the owners of that debt are typically the wealthiest people in the nation. However, this keeps 90% of the population in perpetual tax servitude. But it does not have to be this way. As my friend Bill Marshall put it, while we need to grow the economy, economic growth alone won't fix the issue if we keep borrowing. Growth will happen automatically as we bring back manufacturing to the U.S. As for the austerity program, you could cut the federal budget to $0, except for the interest, and still not pay off the debt. Even if you cut the budget to pre-pandemic levels, all that would do is slow the rate of increase. Also, any discussion involving spending cuts sparks such a fierce debate that it never happens. In the meantime, the borrowing continues out of necessity. The only way to permanently solve the problem is to stop borrowing forever and to pay off the existing debt as it comes due using debt-free U.S. notes. No financing the existing debt. Pay it off. Eliminate the debt ceiling. It won't be needed since we won't be borrowing any more money. So here is the solution according to Grok. Approximately 32% of the $28.95 trillion in publicly held marketable debt matures within 12 months, requiring refinancing rather than repayment according to data from May 2025. But remember, this debt is all in Federal Reserve notes. What if we simply reissued the nation's oldest form of government-issued money, the debt-free United States note, and used that to repay the bonds? U.S. notes are still legal tender in the United States. You can spend even the oldest United States notes because they're still legal tender. Every year, at the current levels of government spending, we could replace 32% of the money supply with U.S. notes and destroy the old Federal Reserve notes they would replace. Within 3.5 years, we could pay off entirely the national debt and probably completely kill off income taxes as well, as long as President Trump continued with his tariff program. Again, according to Grok, tariffs were a primary source of federal revenue in the United States for much of its early history, effectively eliminating the need for an income tax until the late 19th century. But what about other nations which have bought our debt, bonds, notes, and bills? According to Bill Marshall, for any country who wants to continue to have access to the U.S. market, that is, Japan, China, UK, as a prerequisite, they must agree to allow us to pay off any bonds they currently hold with debt-free U.S. notes. Then those bonds will be paid in full, and they can use that money to make investments in the U.S., but they won't collect any more interest. So that's the only solution that can save the American economy from total ruination. Reissue debt-free United States notes to be used initially only to pay off the national debt as the bonds, notes, and bills come due and are returned for their interest payments by the government, and extinguish an equal amount of Federal Reserve notes in the process. During this 4-year replacement process, Congress must pass a constitutional amendment forbidding all future government borrowing. If the nation needs additional money, Congress can simply order the Treasury to issue additional U.S. notes and spend them into circulation. That's it. But isn't that raw money printing? Yes, it is. But that's far better than raw money borrowing, than raw money printing, isn't it? Oh, one last item. Shutter the Federal Reserve and transfer their duties and balance sheet to the U.S. Treasury. Still reporting from just outside the citadel of world freedom. Good day.